세계적인 OTT 플랫폼 관계자들이 OTT 플랫폼에서 한국 콘텐츠의 트렌드와 수요에 대해서 이야기를 나눕니다. 함께해 주실 분들은 드라마 킹덤의 시각 효과를 담당한 스튜디오 매직의 대표로서 마이클 베이 그리고 우리나라 봉준호 감독 등과 함께 작업을 하고 에미상 수상자이기도 한 킴버 림 프로듀서님과 홀로 오리지널의 창립자 샬럿 고 프로듀서님 그리고 과거 넷플릭스 오리지널 담당 부사장이었고 현재는 와일드십 컨텐츠의 설립자이자 대표이신 에릭바먹 대표님께서 함께 하시겠습니다.
Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our panel titled The Trends and Demands of Korean Content on OTT Platforms. My name is Kymber Lim. I'm a producer and consultant focused on Korean cross-cultural content and local language projects with offices in LA and in Seoul. And I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, Charlotte Ko, a media exec and producer and founder of Hulu Originals, and Erik-Ba먹, founder of Wild Sheep Content and former VP of International Originals at Netflix. Thank you so much for both being here. Charlotte, can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experiences in the business?
Sure. So I've been in the business 20 years. I started out as a creative executive at Fox Searchlight Pictures. And since then, I've worked at Marvel during the time of the Disney acquisition. I've also, as you mentioned, started original programming at Hulu, where I worked on almost a dozen television shows. And most recently, I was running unscripted television and digital media for Reese Witherspoon's company, Hello Sunshine.
Great. How about you, Eric?
Yeah, I started my career at Disney in business development, working on international strategy, and then worked at Netflix for close to 9 years and spent the last 5 years heading up international originals, where we worked on shows like Kingdom and Casa de Papel, Sacred Games, basically all of the non-English shows. And we were ramping to about 100 series per year, the final year I was there. And then more recently started Wild Sheep Content, which is an international packaging and production company. And we have shows in development at most of the major platforms with a focus on international production.
Thank you. This is a great topic for Licensing Con this year. And many films and TV series and animations come from existing IP. So we're going to discuss, mostly the US market as it relates to Korean content, but even from a global standpoint, Korean content on OTT platforms, which we also refer to as streamers, have exploded over the years. And due to so many streamers, there's never been a better time for content creators and IP holders, especially those that have a built-in audience. So, but the interest and growth of Korean content, it really is a direct reflection of the Korean wave and its lifestyle, the culture that it represents, through food and beauty, content, music, and its long history. So, as well as, the tech and innovation that comes out of Korea. Almost every distributor has a streaming business now. And so we'll focus just on the major ones, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Disney+, Apple TV, HBO Max. And a lot of these streamers have not entered into the Korean market, but they are interested also in local productions. Clearly, Netflix has a huge presence there. And Amazon, I know, would like to be in Korea doing local productions, but they haven't started yet, to my knowledge. I don't think Hulu has any plans. Disney Plus, same thing, but I think that they're in discussions. And then, HBO Max, I'm sure would love to be there as well, but have not executed that. So, for this huge demand in content in general, can you guys speak about the demand for Korean content and its interest on these platforms?
I'd say there's a few different areas that are important for Korean content in the States. One is on the format side, there's increasing belief that there's just great ideas coming out of Korea. So you see that with The Good Doctor on ABC. You see that with The Masked Singer as a format on Fox. And so I think there's this continued belief and greater investment in talent scouting in Korea because so many of the formats are so innovative. I would say there's a growing belief as well that certain music IPs is super important. So you can see the emergence of like the release of Blackpink's documentary on Netflix, and the fact that Blackpink and most of the other K-pop groups that are major are kind of touring to sold out shows in the US. So that's become something that people are super aware of. And then I would say as these platforms become more and more global, with Netflix being sort of far ahead of the other streaming services, that Korean shows are now traveling globally. And we saw that with Kingdom, which launched as an original on Netflix, and you're seeing it with just the sheer volume of Korean dramas that are now getting licensed as co-productions into Netflix. I would say the other services are farther behind, mostly because they're not in Korea yet, so they haven't had this incentive to go deep and pick up shows like Hospital Playlist and on down the line of all the shows that Netflix is licensing right now. But I would expect that to change over the next couple of years.
So Charlotte, you were one of the first at Hulu to carry so much Korean content. You know, what kind of drove you to acquire so much of that?
Well, the acquisition team at Hulu in the early days in particular, they were looking for the undiscovered gems that would engender a tremendous amount of passionate fandom. And I think one of the advantages of these OTT or streamer platforms in America is that predominantly in terms of the minutes consumed, you will often see a heavy slant towards younger audiences. And pairing that with a more global perspective, thanks to social media and the internet, they're more open to content that is coming from outside of the US. They are looking for what's cool, what's new to discover, not necessarily what everyone's already discovered. And there is, in the words of Mickey Lee, there is a certain uniqueness to Korean content in terms of its edge and its storytelling that I think is very appealing to younger audiences, as well as having a universality of experiences. Of course, K-dramas were the first to kind of come over because they were usually familial conflicts, even if they were set during the Joseon dynasty. They were still things that people felt were relatable, you know, someone marrying the wrong person, or, you know, a child being disobedient. Like, they were things that people outside of the Korean culture could immediately identify with. And that was the other interesting thing, is the vast majority of people on these platforms who are watching K-dramas, as an example, are often not Koreans. They are people who are simply open and seeking out different types of storytelling and are interested in new representation on screen.
Yeah, and I think that's wildly important. Having content from Korea, and I do account a lot of that to authenticity, that they aren't encumbered by trying to stick to some sort of a what we would call the Hollywood structure, or, you know, the things that they don't adhere to. They're wildly more creative. So it makes them more interesting in terms of acquiring some of that here. But it also leads to, you know, trying to find what those special things are, like, and understanding also the trends in the US, as well as things that are going in Korea. Do you find that there are certain types of genres that appeal, you know, better to the streamers and would be more interested in the type of, you know, IP for them?
Well, I think in recent years, you're seeing a lot more of the genres again that are appealing to a more youthful sensibility. So you've got horror thrillers, as well as the dramas and romantic comedies. So those are truly emerging to the top. Again, very relatable things, whether it's love, fear, or sheer human drama. And those tend to be the things that also work well in a serialized format, because you're trying to figure out, well, what happens next? What's the next decision the main character makes? And again, those are genres that really invest a huge amount of emotional fandom if it works, and streamers need to find the kinds of shows that truly capture the audience and make sure that they keep on using it on a daily basis if possible.
Do you have anything to add to that, Eric, in terms of, the type of trend or type of genres that might work the best?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Charlotte has it right. I mean, I think that in some ways, US television has become overly dark and overly self-serious, and with a lot of pressure to have returning series because of the way the economic models work. And so the 20 episode, non-returning, romantic rom-com especially is a lot of fun, and it's escapism at its best. And so like Crash Landing on You, or I mentioned Hospital Playlist earlier, those types of shows, there's a lot of action and there's a lot of sweetness mixed in them without it being so serious. And I think that's a big chunk of what people are responding to.
So what do you see are, the types of IP that Hollywood actually purchases or develops into content? Like, what attracts them? What are some of the common things that they look for in terms of IP? And then what are some of the uncommon ways that maybe some of the viewers are not thinking about that could really help them, get the interest of these platforms?
Look, I mean, I think there's an interesting tension in general of, is it going to be an industry here that is supplying remake rights, so which happened with The Good Doctor, and there's a bunch of, I know that people tried to make Replay 1988 and these other shows that will sort of sit in development for a while, or My Love from a Star is another one that's been people have tried to develop in around town. So is that going to be the way that people do it, which is they sort of say, these are big hit shows, they're onto something, let's try to do the US version of it? Or is it just going to be the case that these global platforms are going to be better at reaching audiences directly with big Korean shows that just get licensed, which is, I think, what Charlotte was talking about with Hulu, and what a lot of what Netflix is doing presently.
Charlotte, what about the other types of IP that, like some of these licenses holders, they're not really going to have a script or treatment or something developed. What else can they do to help get the attention? For example, if they are a webtoon, or they have characters, or maybe they have, some really good story around a product. What's the best way for them to get the attention of these platforms?
Well, the number one thing is pre-awareness with a critical mass of audience. So that's always going to be the best bet in terms of why somebody should pay attention to a non kind of prepackaged piece of intellectual material. So it could be anything from a Korean novel that has had success there and they have an English translation ready to read. It could be a successful serialized podcast. In the US, there have been scripted podcasts like Homecoming, which have been turned into series, in that case on Amazon with Julia Roberts. It can even be like the sticker characters from Line, the messaging app, where Brown and Coney had already had their own Korean animated show, but now are going to have their own animated show on Netflix for the family audience. So it really depends on, can you prove that there is this sort of high concept appeal to the intellectual property you're representing? And is it obvious sort of where it fits in the market and which audience it would get embraced by on a much more broader global basis?
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip, is to, if these license holders can do things to build their audience, whether it's online or, like you said, through podcasts or any other format, even if it's just in Korea, I think that they will definitely get the attention from someone to help them develop that into a property. So I think that's a really good tip. I think that, you know, there might be some questions that the industry, the Korean industry license holders may have to do that. Are there things like product placement that exists on OTT platforms, Eric?
Generally not, or it's not so easy to strike those deals organically. I think, you know, a better approach is really going to be to educate people on what constitutes a big hit. And I'd say there's really only, you know, a dozen or so people in Hollywood that say are focused on webtoon platforms. And so, like, if you have a big show on Naver or one of the webtoon platforms, what does that mean? And how many people are watching it? And why is that a big deal? I think the idea that you're going to take a piece of IP and place it on some other shows, it's possible, but that seems unlikely.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of also like, you know, if they do have beauty products or if they have a washing machine or, you know, other kinds of things that they can place into shows. Like you said, I do think it is tricky for that to happen. You know, OTT platforms don't necessarily go on the sponsorship type of, you know, series or formats. There seems to be a lot of product placement in Korea, especially recently in Korean series. But it does seem really difficult for them to do that here.
I think if they have a beauty product kind of thing, it actually would be more interesting if they had an influencer who had a pretty passionate following and could develop a show around the influencer in the beauty space. Just an example of like, what do we mean by Korean IP that can be applied? Because I keep thinking about Marie Kondo's show. Like there was a best-selling book, but actually Marie Kondo herself is like a specific type of influencer with a following, and that bloomed into a show idea. And I think in the old world, before we had things like Instagram or Twitter, like that would not have been as possible. So just broadening the lens on influencer-inspired intellectual property is a way in.
So what advice would you have in terms of like how much development is actually needed in order to approach these streamers? You know, can they do it just with a character with a stats that says, you know, we have a certain amount of audience, or, you know, can they, if they have a great idea for a story, is it something that is enough to pitch? Where would you, you know, how much development do you think that is needed? Eric, do you want?
Yeah, look, I think it depends. I think you would divide between unscripted and scripted, and unscripted is sort of an international marketplace around formats. So, you know, you're going to prove that the show gets a big rating, and why is The Masked Singer popular, and it's not expensive to produce. I would say on the scripted side, that there's a few different models. Japan is sort of an interesting one where there's a healthy manga publishing community that builds an audience, then that leads to good anime, then that anime leads to some live action, and then some of those properties which have been built over 10 or 15 or 20 years then get remade into Hollywood films, which usually haven't fully captured the spirit of the original. So something often gets lost in the translation. I sort of think that on the scripted side, that what's going to happen is just there's going to be more and more Korean shows that are just popular globally, and they're going to skip a lot of those steps, and that we as an industry should just have confidence that that content will travel. And that will lead to bigger and bigger budgeted Korean shows that will never get remade. But probably over the next 5 years, there's probably going to be a mix of a bunch of different things because the market is so unsettled. And I'd say the important thing will be to have contacts in both Seoul and Los Angeles that can navigate all these things. Because the reality is, I don't see some cookie cutter format that says this is how Korean IP is going to become successful. It's going to be pretty different for each piece of IP in each show.
Yeah, I mean, from a more tactical perspective, I do think buyers in general, in my experience, would like things as developed as possible. So in the scripted space, if you have something as fully developed as a book that you want people to option, there's a path obviously through a New York lit agent to make sure that that happens through the correct channels. But if it's something a little more unformed, like let's say a set of characters, you may need to have an American producing partner, for example, or someone else to frame it as like, what could this be in the American marketplace that makes sense as a show? And then on the unscripted side, you know, in the American market, the unscripted buyers, they tend to want not only some sort of presentation deck that explains the format, what each episode could be like, what the main characters are, what the themes are. They're also usually looking for at least a 3-minute sizzle that will show some footage that can be look and feel, or the footage can show what the talent or host might be, or something that really indicates the tonality of that unscripted show is very important. So in terms of development overall, as much as you can invest in fleshing that out, the better, keeping in mind, of course, that each buyer in America has a slightly different lens through which they're buying.
Yeah, and I think that it is important because the way that we present story and tell stories here are so different than the way that Koreans are used to developing and telling stories. That, you know, like you said, Eric, the bridge, there needs to be some sort of a bridge, meaning if you can have a producer in the US help guide you through your presentation, your story, or whatever it is that you're packaging to produce, is important to do. One thing that I was thinking as you guys were talking is unscripted, and I know that that's not necessarily your guys's expertise, but you know, different ways that people can elevate their brand or their property, and doing it in Korea to start, and garnering that popularity would increase your chances of finding better people to work with here and to approach the streamers more directly. And thinking of clever ways, and reality shows in Korea are so popular that it might be easier to be able to get your, you know, IP onto also some reality series or around, like you said, influencers. And I think that those are all really good suggestions. And so, do you have any other advice in terms of, you know, the IP holder in Korea being able to connect to the right people in the US? US is so burdened with a process and with agents and agencies. Do you have any suggestions on how they can best approach these IT platforms? Because I think just calling them on the phone, is that the right way to do it?
Well, it's definitely advisable that you have an introduction through an intermediary who has already done business with a buyer before. So that's the quickest way. And that could be a producer in Korea who you partner with, who has already had success in selling a format or a show. It could be with an agency that the talent that you are working with has a previous relationship with. But the important thing in Hollywood is that somebody who knows both parties is the intermediary and the go-between. Generally, cold calls are not effective.
Eric, can you talk a little bit about the process of, you know, the IP agreement and what these licensees, licensors can expect in terms of what that process is to license their properties?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say the way legal documentation is handled is quite different in Seoul versus LA. there's kind of a shorthand that people can operate here that usually are 2 or 3 page term sheets that are, I guess I would describe it as much more transactional in nature, whereas I feel like so this is how much you should be paying for an option. These are the rights granted. And you may or may not be dislodged from a project pretty quickly. Thank you for doing business. We'll keep you in the loop, but not necessarily. And my experience in Seoul on a relative basis is that there's a lot of conversations that need to be had about trust and how is the show going to be made and who's going to be involved and how is this going to honor the underlying work. And, frankly, there's merits to both sides. I mean, I think the US is moving at a very fast pace, high volume, and needs that transactional nature because there's a lot going on. But I think, the conversations that we've had in Korea about IP have really been about honoring the IP, but much, much longer time periods to get things done. And so I think when you talk to Americans about dealing with Korean IP, there's often an impatience to how, we have these standard terms. Why is there so much time between drafts and things of that nature? And Korea, maybe it feels like Americans are trying to rush through things and not thinking about the relationship.
Yeah, I think that does come across very often in dealing with IP and trying to get IP agreements through. It does take a lot of time to build trust, and we do that, like you said, transactionally in the US quite often. It's standardized. There's very few points that even need to be discussed. And with Korea, it's still it's a relatively new process still. There are people who have done it, and there's becoming more and more people who are doing that and understanding that process. But for the majority, they've never made an agreement with the US before. And I think that there is a lot of hesitancy in doing that, which, as Charlotte mentioned, it's very important that you have someone who understands both sides. And one of the people that I definitely want to suggest is Coca. They do have offices here, and they're a huge part of the business in Korea, who can help you make those connections. I wanted to see if there's, any other advice that you may be able to give, to people who are interested in doing business with the US, or even, with the streamers that are local to Korea, in being able to get their own products or IP or stories elevated. Any advice that you might be able to give? Charlotte?
I don't know how qualified I am to give this kind of advice. Well, I would say the most important thing is understanding each of the different platforms' needs and requirements. And that's pretty easy to do if you do some research just about recently, who have they done talent deals with, in addition to the most obvious things of what shows seem to be doing well on the platform and are being renewed for subsequent seasons. A lot of it is, how does your IP fit in with the creative strategy of each buyer, and be really prepared to answer that. And then the second piece of that, which is sort of a corollary, which is what audiences will your IP serve on those platforms, and why will it feel original and fresh, but still engender a sense of, familiar passion for that genre, and really making sure that it can translate into an American audience based on the way that you plan to adapt the IP.
There's a time to be optimistic. This is a good time to be optimistic about Korean IP in general. And basically, don't sell yourself short, in the sense that that these OTT platforms are becoming more and more global. That they'll have to understand growth in Asia as part of becoming global platforms, and that because of that, over time, and I don't know if it's over the next 2 years or the next 5 years or the next 10 years, people are going to become more and more interested in the IP that's coming out of Korea, for sure. There's just macroeconomic trends, and that should lead to a level of confidence in telling your story the way you want it to be told, as opposed to thinking, how am I going to cookie cutter into a Hollywood format? So in other words, each year I would expect viewing on Korean content to go up and up and up. And as that goes up and up and up, people are going to come looking for the material. And I agree with Charlotte, basically at the core of things is, as that growth happens, you're going to want to be very targeted and filtered in your approach. But that doesn't mean changing your underlying stories to filter into the US. It's probably going to mean the US changing its underlying story to filter into Korea.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, you can sense just in terms of, you know, with Parasite having won all the awards, or so many awards in the Oscars this year, that it really is about finding an approach to telling your story where we always mention and talk about this global audience, something that is relatable to a lot of people in a very authentic way. And I think that's, you know, how what Korea has been really good at, being able to come up with some, you know, some dark, but also some very romantic ways of presenting their things. I think that is all the time that we have today. I definitely want to thank you both for joining us, and also thank Koka for putting this presentation together, and for Director Charmin Kim, who has also been a part of connecting us all. Thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.